Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph, starting with Ayin Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. The Gemara began with a question: if there are 2 Jews who are sharing the same chutzner, they did not make Erev Chatzeros, and one of those Jews died on Shabbos, and he leaves a Yoresh. Can the Yoresh now mevatil the Reshus on Shabbos? The Gemara brought 2 tzdadim. The Gemara said, on the one hand, only a person who has the ability to make Erev Chatzeros before Shabbos can mevatel Reshus on Shabbos, and this person who was a Yoresh did not have the ability because his father was still alive, and therefore he cannot be mevatel Reshus on Shabbos. Or no, since he's the Karei de Avua, he's the extension of his father, therefore he could mevatel Reshus. Rav Nachman answered he could mevatel Reshus on Shabbos. The Gemara then brought 2 braisos saying that, implying that you cannot mevatel Reshus on Shabbos, and the Gemara was doiche them. Now the Gemara brings a 3rd brisa to ask on Rav Nachman. Toshma Yisrael v'ger sheruyin b'megura achas umeis ger. Here you have a ger tzedek, together with a Jew. The 2 of them are living together in the same chutzner, and a ger, we know, doesn't have yarshim. The ger dies on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, when did he die? First the brisa brings when he dies before Shabbos, mi ba'od yom. Then the brisa brings a 2nd scenario when he dies on Shabbos. Says the brisa, mi ba'od yom, we're on top of Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph, af al pi shehichzik Yisrael echad min nechosov oiser. Here it states, when he died mi ba'od yom, the words of the Bryce and the Reisha say that even though that another Jew were to then acquire his property, still he is oiser. This implies that if another Jew did not acquire the property, then he would certainly be oiser. And that, b'chora, is not true. The Gemara will ask about this. Secondly, the Brisa goes on to say in the Seifa, a scenario when he dies on Shabbos, Mishechashecho, Afal Pisha lo yichzik Yisrael acher eino oiser. Even though another Jew is not machzik, does not then acquire the property of the ger, he is not oiser. Again, the implication is that if indeed somebody did machzik in the property, then certainly he will not be oiser. And again, why is that so? The Gemara now asks, before it asks the question on Rav Nachman from the Brisa, the Gemara first asks on the Brisa to then organize the Brisa and explain it. Ha gufa kashya, says the Gemara, the Brisa is problematic, as we pointed out. Amris, you said, mi ba'od yoim afal pi shehichzik. If the ger died before Shabbos, even though another Jew then is machzik nechosov, implying v'lo mi boi ki lo hichzik. And certainly, if another Jew did not machzik, well, if another Jew did not machzik, there would only be that one Jew in the chutzner. Certainly, that would not be oiser. Ask the Gemara, Adarabba, ki lo hichzik lo osar. If no other Jew were machzik, then he'd be left by himself, and it would not be osar. So the implication from the Reisha, the Brisa, is not correct. Therefore, it's not clear what does the Brisa mean when it says Afal pi shehichzik Yisrael acher b'nechosov is oiser. Omar Papa attempts to explain the Brisa by saying Eima Afal pi shelo hichzik. He changes the language of the Brisa and he says, doesn't mean Afal pi shehichzik, it means Afal pi shelo hichzik. That's what the Brisa is stating. Ask the Gemara, V'ho Afal pi shehichzik tani. But the Brisa states black and white, even though that another Jew is machzik. Says the Gemara, therefore, Hachi ka'omar. This is how you have to explain the Brisa. Afal pi sheloi hichzik. These are the words that really are missing in the Brisa. Mi ba'od yom. Even though he was not machzik. In other words, before we even say what the implication is, it's true. If another Jew is machzik, he will then be oiser. But the afal pi is going on when he was not machzik mi ba'od yom, even though the ger died before Shabbos, mi ba'od yom. As follows, This is what we're adding. Even though he was not machzik, this is kind of chesuri mechzer in the brisa. Mi b'oid yoim ela meshecha shecha. He was only machzik after Shabbos started. Kivin dahava leila hachzik mi b'oid yoim oiser. Here, the chiddush of the brisa is stating that because the ger died before Shabbos, so it's true that technically on the onset of Shabbos, so there was only the other Jew that lived in the Chatzir, so certainly it should be permissible. But here we're saying since the one who was machzik the nechasav on Shabbos could have done so before Shabbos, we'll look at the reshus as being tluya v'oimed, and therefore we'll say it doesn't have a status of being mutter. And that's the chiddush of the brisa. Even though he was machzik, but is only machzik at the onset of Shabbos, mishecha shecha, since he could have done it mi ba'od yoim, when the ger did die, we'll say that is oiser. Now we go to the second part of the brisa, the scenario when the ger died on Shabbos. Here it states, Mashecha shecha afal pisha lo hichzik Yisrael acher eino oiser. At night when he died, even though another Jew did not be machzik, he's not going to be oiser. And again, the implication is that if indeed somebody did be machzik, then that would be, certainly he would not be oiser. Ask the Gemara, afal pisha lo hichzik Yisrael acher. You're saying in the brisa, even though another Jew was not machzik, then he's not oiser. And therefore, v'lo miboy ki hichzik, certainly when he's machzik, you'll say he's not going to be oiser. Adarabba, it's not true. If somebody else was machzik, ki hichzik also, that would be a siba, a reason to oiser. So, says the Gemara, to explain the brisa again, Omer Rav Papa, eima afal pisha hichzik. Again, Rav Papa wants to suggest in the Seifa that the statement of the brisa is, even though that he was machzik, then everything is going to be solved. Even though he was machzik, so then states, he will not be oiser. Says the Gemara, wait, doesn't say that in the brisa though. It states, even though he was not machzik. So how can you suggest otherwise? Explains the Gemara. This is what you have to explain in the brisa. And again, it's red chesuri mechsera. There are words that are missing in the brisa. It means afal pi shehichzik. These are the words that are missing in the brisa. Even though he was machzik meshecha shecha, after night, after it became Shabbos, kivan v'loy havolei lahachzik mi ba'oid yoim eino oiser. Since he did not have the reshus to then acquire the property before Shabbos, because we're saying the ger only died after Shabbos, so since it was mutar, it was hutar from mikzah Shabbos, therefore remains hutar the rest of Shabbos. That's what the Brisa is coming to say in the afal pi. So it comes out that the Brisa in the Reisha states a chiddush, even though he was not machzik until nightfall, when the ger died mi ba'od yoim, before Shabbos, we're going to say that it is oiser. Because again, since he could have done it before Shabbos, and he did not, we'll say that the status is such that it didn't have then the ability to then matir from the onset of Shabbos. It was tluya v'oimedes. In the Seifa of the Brisa, the chiddush is afal hichzik, even though he was machzik mishecha shecha. So since we're saying that it was hutar b'mikzah Shabbos, so it remains mutar for the rest of Shabbos, and therefore it is not oiser. Now the Gemara gets back to then the subject of asking on Rav Nachman, because Rav Nachman stated that a yoresh could be mevatel reshus on Shabbos. Ask the Gemara, ketani mihas reisha oiser. Nevertheless, in the reisha of this brisa, it states that it is oiser. That means to say that when indeed the Yisrael is machzik, the nechas of the ger on Shabbos, he will be oiser. Ask the Gemara why. Why does the oiser the other Jew from using the chotzer? Ask the Gemara, amai oiser nevatel. Why doesn't he just mevatel the reshus? If indeed he could mevatel the reshus, then that would be a solution not to be oiser. And yet the Brisa says he's oiser. So it's a kasha on Rav Nachman. Answers the Gemara, my oiser nami diktoni achi yevatel. That which it says that is oiser means until he is mevatel the reshus. but he could mevatel the reshus, as Rav Nachman stated. The Gemara now brings an alternative explanation of the previous brises. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Rabbi Yochanan says that indeed he cannot mevatel reshus on Shabbos. Why? Because this is a shita of Beis Shammai, who says in our Mishnah that one Shabbos comes, one cannot mevatel reshus on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Masnaisa Mami, who are these brises according to, that we asked on Rav Nachman from, that state, that imply that one cannot mevatel reshus on Shabbos? We were doiche them. But says the Gemara, who are these brises? We don't have to doiche them. They're Beis Shammai. These brises are altered by Beis Shammai. The Amrei, who say, Ein bitul reshus b'Shabbos, one is not allowed to mevatel the reshus on Shabbos. That's shita Beis Shammai. As our Mishnah states, this nan me'emos aynoisni reshus, when do we say you can mevatel reshus? Beis Shammai only before Shabbos. Beis Hillel says after Shabbos starts, you can also have mevatel reshus. And therefore, if a person forgot to make Erev Chatzeros before Shabbos, now it's Shabbos, he can go ahead and mevatel reshus, says Beis Hillel. Omar Ula explains, my time of the Beis Hillel, what is the reasoning for Beis Hillel to allow to mevatel reshus on Shabbos? Says the Gemara, Kiznase ke'oimer klach etzel yafois. Because just like a person who appointed a shaliach to take truma on his behalf, then he comes back and he sees that his shaliach took truma from a very high quality, expensive grain. If he says klach etzel yafois, if he says you should have taken from the better quality, meaning even better ones, or you could have taken from better ones, and he does have better ones, that implies that he means it, and therefore we say that it was a good shlichus. Retroactively, it was a good shlichus. So too over here, if you see that somebody's now mevatel reshus on Shabbos, is Beis Hillel, then it's just being megale his ratzon that he wanted to do before Shabbos. Only he didn't make an erev chatzeros, he didn't get a chance to do so. He was able to also mevatel reshus, so he does so on Shabbos. Omar Abaye asks, Meis nochi b'Shabbos my klach etel yafois iko. If in the scenario where a goy dies on Shabbos, there we had a machlokes earlier, and Rav Sheishes explained that indeed, if a goy dies on Shabbos, one can mevatel reshus, and the halach is like Rav Sheishes. So ask Abaye, where is this a concept of klach etel yafois on Shabbos etel hagoy etel hanochri? Behold, when it comes to klach etzel yafois, we said he made a shaliach to then take his truma. Then he comes to him and he says to him, "Why don't you take better ones? You could have taken better ones." So therefore, he had the ability to then go ahead and do so. He's going to say that that's going to be a valid shlichus. That's because he made a mashniach before Shabbos. But over here, in a scenario where a nachri died on Shabbos, there is no such ability to then make it before Shabbos. It's not going to be megale now on Shabbos that's what his ratzon was before Shabbos, because it would belong to a nachri. So therefore, there's no such concept of klach etzel yafois by a nachri as Abai. So that cannot be the rationale for Beis Hillel to allow one to mevatel reshus on Shabbos. Elohacha b'hakmifli. Rather, Abai explains this is the machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Why Beis Hillel maintains you could mevatel reshus on Shabbos. The Beis Shammai savrei bitul reshus mikne reshusahu umikne reshus b'Shabbos also. He says because by mevatel your reshus you're making a transaction, and since you cannot make a transaction, it's an isur mekach or memkar. Midivrei kabbalah mimtzo cheftzecha. We learn out that you cannot go ahead and make a transaction on Shabbos. Midivrei kabbalah, the words of Yeshaya Hanavi. Therefore, you cannot go ahead and mevatel your reshus, says Beis Shammai. Ubeis Hillel Savrei istaluke rishuso be'almahu. All you're doing is removing yourself from the rishus. You're not making a transaction. You're not being makna to somebody else to his rishus. You're just being mafkir your rishus. V'istaluke rishus b'Shabbos shaper dami. And therefore, Beis Hillel says you can do that. You can mevatel rishus on Shabbos.